Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on tokenization and digital identity in Latin America. My name is Abel Delgado. I'm the Digital Marketing Director for America's Market Intelligence, and I'm going to be serving as the moderator today. So before we get started, we just want to give you a quick overview of who we are as a company. We have been around for more than 25 years studying Latin America in a variety of different sectors, especially payments, and we've conducted more than 300 studies in that area. So as part of that work, we like to share some of the knowledge and the things that we're working on with people in the industry to spark dialogue and just to promote further education in that area. So that's who we are. And now today I'm going to introduce our speakers. They're actually going to introduce themselves. So we like to do that first so you get to know who they are and what they're going to be talking about today. So we're going to start off with Lindsay Lear, the director of our payments practice. Lindsay.
Thank you, Abel. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Many of you may know me, some of you may not. My name is Lindsay Lear. I lead the payments practice here at AMI. I will be delivering most of the content in today's webinar, and I really look forward to a dynamic conversation. I'm joined today by two very talented panelists, and I'll have each of them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what they're up to, starting with Eduardo. Eduardo? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, hi,
there
Lindsay.
We go.
I'm Eduardo Rivara, founder and CEO of Facenode, and we develop a facial recognition platform that enables retailers to identify their customers at stores using commercial cameras, tablets, mobile devices, providing new store experiences like loyalty rewards, discounts, and now facial payments. So imagine entering a store, your favorite store, and being greeted like, "Hi, Lindsay, it's good to have you back, and today you have a 20% off." So unlike existing biometric solutions, we are 100% focused on customer privacy.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And we're also joined by Justin Benson of Spreedly. Justin.
Thanks, Lindsay. It's great to be here and really nice to speak with everybody. I'm the CEO for Spreedly. We're a payments company in North Carolina, and we really focus in on merchants. And what we do is we work with merchants. We allow them to connect to multiple payment providers simultaneously. So we're a credit card vault. We built our own technology there. We tokenize credit cards. We've got integrations into more than 100 different payment endpoints and lots of other third-party services as well. In fact, some of our biggest customers are in the Latin American region, like Rappi, like Sinopolis, like Cabify. And as they move into different countries and work with different payment processes and have, different challenges depending on what that particular market is, they use us as a payment orchestration layer to help them manage those cards on file, securely store them, create tokens, and then route transactions based on their needs.
All right, thank you so much, Justin. Well, let's go over the format today so you have an understanding of basically how that's going to be. Essentially, we're going to have the presentation of some data and some of these trends that are happening in terms of tokenization and digital identity. And then we're also going to be opening the floor for a panel discussion to allow our panelists to offer their perspective as far as this is concerned. And at different points in time, we'll let you know we'll be taking audience questions and that you can ask an audience question at any point in time. If you look at the black bar on your screen, you should see an icon that says Q&A, and if you click on that, it should bring up a window, and that'll allow you to type in your question. So feel free to ask a question anytime, and we'll be stopping the presentation at different points to be able to address those questions and also at the end of the presentation. So you just basically have to click on that Q&A icon, and you'll be able to ask any question. So this is our legal notice. So the thing I think that's important here to understand is that the opinions and analysis that are presented here today are from our company, America's Market Intelligence. So they represent only the view of our AMI speakers in our company. They do not represent those of the panelists. They'll speak for themselves in that sense. The rest of it talks about liability and responsibility with regard to the information that's being shared today. I'm not going to go through that because that'll kind of drag us down and we're kind of pressed for time, but we encourage you to read that at your leisure. So that covers that particular ground. So next up, basically, this is the part where I'm going to turn things over to Lindsay Lear to actually kick off our presentation. And she'll be going through some of these major trends and the one that we're talking about today. Lindsay.
Thank you, Abel. Again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Many of you may know that last month we hosted a webinar on 6 megatrends in payments in Latin America that we'll observe throughout 2020. And our plan for the next 6 months is to then do a deep dive into each of these trends. Our first trend, our first webinar, the topic of today's webinar is moving from cards to credentials. What does this mean? As the payment ecosystem digitizes, we are observing that physical cards are starting to lose relevance in favor of physical payment, digital payment credentials. So we'll be looking at this in more detail today and the technologies that are required to enable a smooth user experience as this trend is taking place. So let's dive right into our content. If we take a look at the next slide, just to begin the groundwork of the context we're looking at in Latin America. Now, I know many of you are already have your smartphones out and are taking pictures of this slide. Rest assured, everyone will receive a copy of this deck with all of the data contained in it, okay? But I wanted to lay the context, lay the groundwork a little bit as to what we mean by e-commerce and how this looks demographically in the region. Why are we talking about e-commerce? E-commerce is otherwise known as the card not present environment. And keep in mind that this includes not only shopping online at your favorite retailers, it also includes in-app payments, card on file payments, recurring payments, all of which take place without the use of a physical plastic card. We know that this vertical is growing, but let's look at it a little bit more in detail. Today in Latin America, we have 216 million online shoppers. That represents about 47% of the adult population. That's up from 25% just 24 months ago. So demographically, we have millions of people coming into the card not present environment on a daily basis, including people who have cards and people who do not have cards. The carded population represents 89% of online shoppers. So 89% of our shoppers have a credit or debit card already. This is the preferred payment method for online shopping. We also know that we have a segment of uncarded folks using e-commerce, using an alternative payment method like a cash voucher, a bank transfer, or even cash on delivery. Okay, let's look at how this will change in the next 2 years. Okay. When we think about 2020, we have an overall growth of 16% in the number of online shoppers. So we can see that this is continuing to grow, continuing to accelerate. We see growth both of carded online shoppers and uncarded. And actually that uncarded population is growing faster, more than twice the rate. This means that adoption of e-commerce is growing faster than adoption of electronic payment methods. And this is important for us to observe because it indicates the momentum that the card not present environment has. If you have uncarded folks at a lower level of digital readiness moving into a digital environment, that indicates that this vertical and this payment space is increasingly relevant to people's lives, including people who are not as digitized as our credit and debit card holders. So from a demographic standpoint, we can see that e-commerce has not yet stagnated, but is continuing to grow. Okay, when we think about this from a purchase volume standpoint, we actually look at the market size of e-commerce. Today, e-commerce represents just over $100 billion of sales. And we observe two very important trends. Number one, e-commerce is growing at 19% annually over the next 3 years. And we can see that that's 4 times the rate of overall retail. So this card not present environment is growing exponentially compared to retail in physical stores, which more or less tends to mirror GDP growth, more or less. The other important trend is that we know this empirically and we know this anecdotally that mobile is gaining relevance. Today it represents 49% of all e-commerce volume. And take a look at how that is going to accelerate from now until 2022. Desktop purchases are going to begin to stagnate, growing at 7%, still decent, but quite minimized when we compare mobile growth, growing at more than 30% per year. So when we think about enabling our business for the future, mobile is certainly a key component. And when we look at the breakdown of e-commerce, retail still represents about 50% of all volume. But interestingly, it's starting to move into other verticals where traditionally the purchasing and consumption has taken place in a physical environment. So of our 216 million online shoppers today, 75% of them have a shopping app on their phone. But 64% of them have a transportation app. We know that Uber and others have been massively successful in the region. 51% have a food delivery app. These last two verticals are showing how e-commerce and the card not present payment behavior is moving into traditionally physical experiences. And this is where we start to contemplate what is the future of the physical card when digital experiences are moving into traditionally physical verticals. Okay, we can take a look at this on the next slide. We know that here is just a smorgasbord of diversity of apps that we see in the region. Now, Uber globally really delivered to us the first what we call the invisible payment, potentially the most disruptive payment evolution that we've seen in the past 10 years, I would say, in which that payment is invisible. It is completely seamless. The user doesn't even feel it. It takes place automatically. Of all of the payment innovations we've seen, this has, in my opinion, been the most powerful and promoted the most change. Uber today has 36 million users in the region. That's only 16% of total online customers. So imagine the runway they still have to grow among e-commerce users, and even more when we consider the millions of people who are coming to e-commerce for the first time, getting exposed to a card on file transaction. Now, Uber and others have really set the bar in terms of payment user experience. And as consumers learn about the card on file or invisible payment experience, they'll start to expect or desire this in other areas. So when we think about brick and mortar, something that is potentially very disruptive to our industry is the movement, the evolution of the card on file or invisible payment into brick and mortar. We have Cinépolis and other ticketing companies already doing this, Magazine Luiza and Tiendas Ripley, a couple of the most innovative brick and mortar companies developing card on file or QR code solutions for their stores. Now, I'm not here to argue the merits of a retailer having its own wallet, but this does show us that brick and mortar entities are trying to replicate this experience in the physical environment. And of course, long tail merchant acceptance. When we think about Rappi, when we think about Mercado Pago, Ichi from Banco Itaú, enabling this card on file or seamless digital payment experience for smaller merchants, neighborhood stores, restaurants, those who don't necessarily have the capabilities to create that experience themselves, relying on third-party providers to give their customers access to this excellent payment experience. So we can see how this digital payment experience moving into the physical environment. On the next slide, this slide is potentially the most impactful of our entire discussion today. What does this mean moving forward? Now, I get a lot of pushback when I give this presentation, physical cards losing relevance. Similar to the question, when will cash disappear? I am not here to say that cards are disappearing or will ever disappear. There is enough critical mass and enough demand for every type of payment method. And the goal of our industry should be to give consumers ultimate choice, right? However, we cannot be ignorant of this trend and how it will change the payment mix over the next 10 years. So if we look at today, or 2019, physical POS transactions made up 90% of all card transactions in the region. Clearly very dominant. Okay, but let's look at how that might change in the next 10 years using both a conservative and an aggressive forecast. In 2030, if we consider 5% retail growth and 15% e-commerce growth, which is slower than how it's growing today, look at how this payment mix will change. We have POS, physical POS representing 68%. Look at how it's lost share, and e-commerce and QR code gaining share. If we think about an aggressive forecast in which QR code really starts to dominate, growing at 30%, which is feasible considering its small base today, retail still growing at 15%, physical POS transactions have lost almost half their share. So even in 2030, we have physical POS still representing 60% of all transactions, still majority, but their share has significantly declined in favor of digital, two different digital payment experiences. So, you know, we need to think about what this means for our industry, depending on who we are in the industry, and what technologies do I need to enable to take advantage of this trend. An important thing to note on this slide is when I am talking about physical POS transactions, I'm talking about a physical card being inserted, swiped, or tapped at the POS. The trend I'm speaking to is those payment credentials, which are inside a card, being transferred to the digital space, to a digital credential. So I'm not talking about an alternative payment method replacing credit or debit card volume. I'm simply talking about that physical card being replaced by credentials in the cloud. Okay, so we can see that a little bit on the next slide. This trend means that physical payment credentials are being put in the cloud, and there are several different formats in which that can take place. We have in-app card on file, which we've talked about, a QR code, an NFC mobile wallet, or a wearable, different ways in which that payment credential can be digitized. So for merchants in your particular market and in your particular vertical, merchants need to think about and be able to forecast which of these form factors is going to really take off, and which do I need to be able to enable, which do I need to invest in to make sure my customers can pay the way they want to pay. For payment companies, the important thing here is thinking about, for mostly banks and card networks, in a physical environment in which I'm opening my wallet, all of my cards are there for me to choose from. And that choice is all of those cards pretty much have equal chance to be used. But once a payment credential is digitized, that payment credential becomes much stickier. You know, when you're taking an Uber ride, you don't pause to think, which card do I want to use? You use the one you've already saved. So for banks and card networks, the strategy needs to be, how can I get my card to be the one that is put on file when a consumer is enrolling for the first time? And what are some strategies that I can implement to get customers and consumers to change payment methods, which is a difficult barrier to overcome? These will be the questions that will dominate this environment in the coming years. Okay. Next, now I would be, in this whole discussion, I would be remiss if I did not take a moment to talk about contactless cards. Again, contactless cards, it's the physical manifestation of the card, but we have a digital transmission occurring. Now the card networks are very intent on contactless cards. They've issued mandates requiring their cards, all newly issued cards and terminals, to be contactless ready. The biggest challenge is that the banking community in multiple countries have resisted this transition, mostly because of the additional cost of issuing a contactless card. But this story does not get told enough in the industry. Let's look at how contactless has accelerated and gained penetration in markets where it has been embraced by the majority of banks, namely Chile and Costa Rica. In these markets today, contactless cards, after 3 to 4 years of being available, have surpassed 40% penetration of card transactions, which is really impressive. You go to Chile, contactless is a reality wherever you pay. This is compared to QR code, which has been around for less time, but has made much smaller gains, today representing about 2 to 3% of card transactions. We know that QR code has a greater learning curve, a harder adoption model, whereas contactless cards is a much swifter process. So really, you know, when we think about which technology will prevail, this data here is quite telling. And what banks need to be aware of is that if banks are looking to preserve that tactile relationship with their customer, in which customer takes out a card, sees the bank, and that bank brand remains top of mind, very important to enable contactless cards, because we can see it gaining penetration, gaining share, and really providing a very seamless user experience and a way to compete with other digital types of payment. Okay, on to the next slide. So we're going to get into our panel in just a moment. When we're thinking about this trend, the question to ask is, okay, you know, there's really no arguing that this trend is occurring. So the question to ask is, how can I be prepared, and how can I leverage and benefit from this trend? And when we're thinking about from a merchant perspective and a payment provider perspective, there are 3 key components that we need to think about to enable and harness the transition from a physical credential to a digital credential. Number 1 is integrations with the right payment processors or payment partners, being able to have a seamless relationship with the payment provider that can enable these capabilities, technologies, and help you scale regionally. And the second 2, which we'll be really diving into today, is tokenization, right? The ability to securely store card credentials in the cloud. Tokenization is one key technology to do that. And digital identity, specifically the use of biometrics. As the payment credential becomes digitized, it only follows that authentication must also be digitized. You lose the value of a digital transaction if once the payment is taken care of, you then have to remove your physical ID and hand it to the cashier. You lose the value of the benefit of that digital transaction. So we can expect biometrics and other forms of digital identity to start to continue to accelerate. Okay, so with that brief overview, let's move into our panel. I'm going to invite Justin to join us.
Thanks very much, Lindsay.
Cool. So Justin, in your intro, you said a really key term. You said you are a credit card vault. And I love that image that captures what we're talking about very well. Can we start off by simply, with a brief, for those of us who don't know, a brief explanation of what tokenization is and why it's relevant to what we're talking about?
Sure. So, you know, on a very literal level, when we think about tokenization, it's the idea of taking sensitive information and replacing it with a string or a text or some type of information that, you know, it is in of itself useless without the original context. So you're taking sensitive information and replacing it with a string or a code that in and of itself isn't of value to somebody. When we think about credit card tokenization and we think about merchants today, there really was, you know, there really sort of 2 alternatives up until very recently, and that was that you did all your credit card tokenization at your payment processor. You know, you embedded an iframe or you managed a mobile app, and you integrated that, and it worked that way for you. And from there, you stored your cards and you got a token. The other was that you became, if you're a large enough merchant, you became PCI compliant yourself, and you bought hardware modules and did it on your own. Spreedly is sort of a best of both worlds. If we get it right, you get this cloud-based SaaS. It's not your problem to manage, but you get the benefit of it being your cards, your data, you know, your tokens. It's stored away from a payment process. It gives you lots of flexibility with things that you can do. What's very recent is this concept of network tokenization. Visa, MasterCard, all the networks are talking about it. And that's what we're seeing driving a lot of, you know, that's the underlying technology driving things like Apple Pay and Google Pay and watch payments. Garmin Pay is another one that runs on top of that. And that's the idea where the network is creating the token. By network, we mean Visa or MasterCard. They're taking that card that you might, when you go and register your card through Apple Pay, they no longer need to keep the actual PAN in the phone. They replace it with a network token. They can link it all up behind the scenes in the network and know who you are and how you're routing that payment. So network tokenization is a fairly new concept that merchants also have to think about. And it makes it, when you first come to this space and you're thinking about it, it's probably today there's really those three buckets. Are you going to get tokens done at the payment provider, use a third-party service like Spreedly, and then what do you think about network tokens going forward?
Okay, great. So there's a lot there. I want to unpack a little bit this discussion about network tokens and the difference between those and tokenization as we've known it over the past couple of years. Can you, in simple terms, explain the difference and what decisions do merchants need to make when it comes to setting up tokenization or deciding to work with a Spreedly or another third-party provider?
Yeah, so one of the early drivers for network tokens was a cost factor for the networks. As we began to see some of these really high-profile breaches, particularly in the U.S. at retailers like Target, but also happening on a smaller scale across many merchants and many payment providers, there's a real genuine cost to the networks of contacting their cardholder, refunding fraud, creating new plastic, mailing it out, and having that registered again. So they began to ask this question of, can we create a proxy, for that card? And so that if an individual, vendor or individual merchant is hacked, that we just have to solve for those tokens that sit there at that merchant, and the underlying PAN can still continue to operate. And so that was sort of this cost driver for them. At the same time, they sort of saw business model opportunities around, the early things like Apple Pay. And it's that same concept, right? Like if you lose your phone, you can remove, Apple Pay, remove that network token. You don't have to go and cancel your card and have every other service linked to that card. So network tokens were really, really beneficial from kind of expediency, cost perspective, high security for the networks. For the merchants, the value proposition, wasn't as clear out of the gate. And we saw from, just where we sat, we saw the network sort of trying to think about different ways to position this and also make it valuable for the merchant. And we've really sort of settled in on two big value propositions for the merchants today as it relates to network tokens. One is it's effectively replacing the account updater service, which is popular in some regions. It never really had great traction in LATAM. So for many Latin American merchants, they probably know a little bit about it, but are not using it. So network tokens replace the old account updater service where you could go and talk to the network and say, hey, I have this PAN and it's about to expire, and update me so everything runs seamlessly. Well, now a network token replaces that. And so I think that's obviously super valuable.
So is it fair to say that network tokens provide a greater level of, I don't know if interoperability is the right word, but it sounds like it provides more fluidity and a less of a fragmented environment.
Yes, and I would say continuity. So if you're
that's a good description.
In a digital wallet, subscribing to a service, paying utilities, this network token is going to remain evergreen, and you should escape the old problem of their card expired, the payments failing, email them.
Okay, that sounds like it solves a really key pain point, because one key element to enabling and preserving a digital environment is having that user experience flow every time, especially in Latin America, in which one red flag or one hitch, that customer is very likely to just revert back to cash.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, got it. One other question I have, Justin, is, you mentioned a couple of your clients at the beginning. They're mostly digital natives, right? Or many of them are digital natives. Can you speak to what implications this technology has for traditionally brick and mortar merchants and how they can, is this valuable for them? And what kind of trends or have you observed?
Yeah, I think when you talk to brick and mortar, typically the biggest challenge for them is this idea around omni-channel and understanding the customer. And they're trying, they're hopefully standing up. Most brick and mortar are trying to look and think about digital payments as well in some format, traditional e-commerce store, or non-traditional things like, hey, maybe you're in petroleum, gasoline products, you want people to pay now digitally at the pump, but many will still pay traditionally. So omni-channel is a really interesting, a huge dilemma for them to fully understand. Someone rewards, motivations, things like that. Network tokens it's still early days, but they have the potential to kind of tie a user together behind the scenes at the network. So if I'm old school or something's not working and I use my card at your pump, or I use my card inside your brick and mortar, and then later on I use a digital wallet with that card also underneath, there's a possibility for the networks to put together better reporting to give that merchant an understanding, like, oh, even though it was a network token, or even though it came through a digital channel, that's actually Lindsay buying, and that gives us a full view if she's a more important customer, if she's moving more aggressively towards digital. Maybe we need to increase coupons, get her attention. So there's some value for definitely for them in terms of omni-channel. It's still, like I say, it's early, but there's some experimentation happening there for benefits.
So it supports loyalty a little bit. It provides more data, more of a full 360 view of customer behavior.
Yes, if you're trying to drive a loyalty program, you're going to frustrate your customers if they're purchasing through a channel and you're not recognizing them. It's going to undermine your loyalty program. So it could help support a loyalty program by saying, we can see you now if you're shopping in this particular way or buying through this, if you use a digital wallet, and as long as that underlying PAN is the same, they should be able to connect the dots.
And just for those of us who don't know, can you specify what PAN means?
Yeah, it's the number that sits on your credit card. It's the one that's important. It's the one that's vital. It's the one we all know and try and type in on a phone 3 years ago late at night and continually fail to get to be successful.
Got it. Okay. I like what you're saying about omni-channel, because I think for brick and mortar, that's a critical question. In Latin America, especially, in which logistics, last mile logistics has not evolved to the state it needs to fully enable e-commerce. So many people live in apartment buildings where with doormen, where you're not, and there's a security issue of receiving a package at home. And we know that mobile is absolutely dominant in browsing and researching products. People like to then buy it online and pick it up in the store, especially in cities in which it's easy to get to your location and pick up a package. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And making that loyalty program equally omni-channel enabled.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, it's really efficient.
Okay, perfect. Justin, anything else you want to mention with respect to the trends we discussed, any of the data, anything jump out at you, anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think when we think about the trends, you think about the
hang on, Justin, the audio is very distorted.
Is that better?
No, unfortunately not. Hang on a moment. Abel, are you hearing that distortion as well? You're on mute.
Yes, he's breaking up a little bit.
Okay, Justin, I apologize. We can't really understand you. So we'll see if it resolves itself and come back to you towards the end.
Okay, sounds good.
Great. The joys of live webinar and dealing with technology.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we do have a really good question. So Justin, I'll read you the question that we're going to ask you later on for you to be thinking about. And this, I think, will be useful for our panel at the end of the discussion. How do you see instant payments disrupting these card present or card not present transaction volumes? Justin, I know you work mostly with credit cards, and of course, alternative payments, bank transfers are going to become increasingly relevant in the next couple of years. So chew on that question, and we'll come back to you. Okay. All right, excellent. So let's continue. We spoke a little bit about tokenization, card on file, invisible payments. Now we'll move into another technology that we need to think about in enabling this digital environment, which is digital identity. Why are we talking about digital identity? This is actually a massive industry. We don't hear about it within payments as regularly because it is an industry in and of itself. It's adjacent to payments and it's intimately involved in what we're talking about, but it is much more broad and has lots of different use cases. Globally, 1 billion people worldwide lack ID. And in Latin America, that number is 34 million people. And a valid ID is the very first component you need for financial inclusion to open a bank account or any other type of financial service. So this has, number one, implications for financial inclusion. Secondly, digital identity really opens us up, really sets us up to enable a digital lifestyle. Okay, digital identity is used for digital onboarding, neobanks and other fintechs using a selfie or other type of digital authentication to onboard those customers for the first time. And so once you do that, once you have a digital experience as your very first interaction, you set that customer up for a digital lifestyle. And increasingly, as we look at the millennial population and even younger than that, that is what customers will be expecting for all of their commerce and payment experiences. So really important to think about, how do we enable digital identity and how do we embed it into our payment flow? Okay, on our next slide. Important to observe in Latin America that digital identity is already a big deal. It's already taken root at the national scale. We have government projects in full implementation. In Argentina, el DNI Digital, or digital ID card, launched in 2019, in which you have your valid ID on your smartphone. In Brazil, the government implementing biometric project, capturing biometric information to be used for voter registration. And as of January 2020, already 78% of the population has enrolled in this program. So at the national scale, we see biometric digital identity databases being captured, which has endless use cases, and only really provides evidence of the momentum that we're gaining here, and that consumers are willing, most importantly, that consumers are willing to make their biometric information available to the government, which is really significant in a region in which there is historic mistrust of the government, and giving over any type of personal information can be considered dangerous, risky, or just I prefer not to. So really important to note. In the private sector, in the next slide, this is also occurring at a scale that probably most of us don't realize, with leading entities already embracing digital identity. Banco Itaú in Brazil, for several years now, has enabled tactile thumbprint authentication for ATM transactions. 2 billion transactions annually for 35 million enrolled customers. That's more than the population of several countries in Latin America, and more than 50% of their own user base. So we have the Brazilian population in many respects already familiar with biometrics. Our own research supports this. In a study we did last year with Visa, in which we evaluated the level of innovation among the region's top entities in the industry, we found that 39% of issuers we interviewed, 14% of acquirers, and 18% of brick and mortar merchants were already using biometrics to some degree. Some of the most common use cases we see, again, digital onboarding, and for loyalty, which we'll get into a little bit with Eduardo. We have not yet seen digital identity and biometrics be used for payment authentication per se, with the exception of Apple Pay. But that is the next frontier of the evolution of this industry. And we can note a couple of very important names already using digital identity in their operations, whether it be for onboarding or for other uses. So note who is on this list and note who is not on this list. This takes place behind the scenes, so it's not always easy to observe whether or not entities are using biometrics. But we can see that enabling digital identity in any of its formats will be critical to remaining innovative, remaining cutting edge, and providing the best experience for your customers. Okay, as we go on. Now the question, this slide to me is absolutely fascinating and quite surprising. Whenever we talk about Latin America, the question is, will consumers adopt it? Are consumers ready for this technology? And biometrics, which has a very particular creepiness factor, again, whether or not consumers are willing to share their physical, literally their physical information. So this is data from a study produced by MasterCard at the end of 2019, so very recent, speaking about digital security and consumer preferences. Now, 47% of the universe for this survey was e-commerce users, online shoppers. So 40% of this population said it's a hassle to use my passwords. We know this ourselves, using passwords for almost everything we do online, how much of a hassle it can be when you forget your password, you lose your password, you have to set up a new password. So Latin Americans feel the same way. Now, 74% of respondents said, I wish I could use biometrics instead of a password to validate my identity. Think about how powerful that is. Increasingly, payments is becoming a user experience game. Whoever has the best user experience will win. It's becoming that competitive. Now, survey data I like to take with a grain of salt, because when you are filling out a survey, it's easy to check the boxes. What do I wish? What do I like? What do I prefer? It doesn't always necessarily translate into your behavior actually at the POS or in your payment flows. So again, 74 seems very high to me. But even if it were 50%, this is still a really significant number. I wish I could use biometrics. And if you are able to provide that validation experience to your customer, you're going to have an advantage over your competitors. Now, when we look at preferred feature for online payments, we can, again, another vote for biometrics, we have 75% prefer biometrics over other types of identity validation, over voice and speaker purchases and online chatbot. I get a lot of questions about the potential and prospects for Alexa or Google Home in Latin America, voice activated payment. This gives us a little bit of insight. Because biometrics still has a tactile or physical element to it, this provides a little bit more security and comfort than a voice transaction, which feels very, very futuristic for a lot of people still. So some very interesting insight about consumer thoughts and preferences around this technology. Okay. And then finally, one important thing to keep in mind for merchants and others who are trying to enable digital identity for their customers, we'll talk about this also with Eduardo, is the life cycle, right? When you're asking a consumer to change any type of behavior or adopt any new technology, there is a life cycle, and there are challenges along the way for each phase of this life cycle. Number one, enrollment, getting a customer to simply sign up. What do we have to do to convince someone to give us their biometric information? Again, that creepiness factor, which is very alive and well in Latin America. Validation, issuance, and usage. So even though we have an acceleration of adoption of this technology, merchants cannot assume that consumers will easily adopt this technology in their actual behavior. So we'll talk in a moment about some of these challenges and ways to get over these challenges as we incorporate biometrics and other things into our payment flow. Okay. All right. So at this time, I'm going to invite Eduardo to join us. Hi, Eduardo. Thank you so much for being here. So I want to talk with you first about if you could tell us a little bit more about your product and Facenote, what you're doing. We know that you use it primarily as a loyalty tool. and then we'll be transitioning into biometrics for payments. So I want to know if you could tell us a little bit about this and why you chose this flow, first of all, to penetrate this industry.
That's perfect. Yes. I mean, when we started Facenode 3 years ago, we had three main goals that we were trying to achieve. First was trying to reduce the creepiness factor that you mentioned. We spent the past 20 years feeling and seeing biometrics being used for security, for loss prevention, for asset protection. So the general public have this feeling of biometrics being used to control them. So this installed a lot of fear about this technology. So we were asking ourselves, how can we overcome this creepiness factor? The second point was, how can we do it in a privacy respectful way? How can we use this technology being 100% compliant with privacy regulation and respecting customer privacy? And third, how can we use this in a way that it will have a very clear return of investment for the store? So with this in mind, we developed our initial technology, and we started working with some retailers, mostly Melissa shoes and some other brands that were really first movers and were willing to try this fantastic technology and say, so we try a lot of different ways of engaging the customer. So we learn a lot of valuable lessons from there. First, you need to be absolutely transparent with the customers. You need to give them a very clear opt-in, opt-out way of the technology. And then the most powerful thing that we learn is that if you explain to the customer what are you going to get their biometric for, and what are they going to get by texting a selfie, for example, or registering, they're going to have any benefit, some discount, they're happy to do it. But you need to be very clear on for what are you going to use it, and that they have the control of this technology.
So Eduardo, can you walk us through that user experience a little bit? I mean, how, very practically, how do you communicate that to the customer? Is it within an app? Is it when they walk into a store and there's someone there to explain to them how this works? How do you transmit the message?
Yeah, that's a good question. We tried different configurations. For example, entering a store and being recognized from a camera. The problem with that is that the user don't feel that he's in control. So the final way that we did it is mostly by having an iPad or a tablet at the store where you see your own face. You can approach that device, and then you are invited to take a selfie there and be recognized the next time you walk in. So the next time you come back to the store, for example, Melissa Shoes at Lincoln Road. So you enter the store, you see the iPad, and then when you see yourself at the iPad, you will see a greeting like, "Hi, Lindsay, it's great to see you back. Today you have a 20% off a pair of shoes." So ideally, you need to show the customer what you are doing. I mean, we can do it in an invisible way. We can use the security cameras, but we chose to just show the customer a big screen when they see their face and they see what's going on. So the customer experience and the customer journey basically is you somehow submit a selfie to be part of this experience at your favorite store. And then you can text it, you can Instagram it with a hashtag, you can send it by WhatsApp, you can email it, but you can also check it at the same store with an iPad. And then when you go back, customers, every time they come back, they will check themselves on the iPad, see what kind of discount they have today, for example.
Got it. Okay. And what you guys decided to go with a selfie. Can you speak a little bit to the advantages and disadvantages of a selfie versus a thumbprint or another type of biometric?
Well, yes, the way we see it is that how we humans recognize each other naturally is by looking at each other's faces. So we don't check, another person's when we recognize on the street. So the way we see it is that this is the most natural way for humans to recognize each other, and naturally, it's the best way for technology to do the same by trying to recognize them with our face. So the thing about the selfie is that it involves the customer taking part of the process. So if I just get an image of you entering a store, of course I can get your biometrics, but that won't be respectful of your privacy. So by asking you to submit a selfie first, you put the customer on the driver's seat. You tell them basically, hey, take your phone, snap a selfie, and be part of this experience. So this is
Okay.
what works absolutely fantastically well.
That
Although
makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's how we interact with each other. It feels less science fiction than your
Exactly.
thumbprint, right? That makes a
Exactly.
lot of sense to me. Okay.
And then, of course, by seeing the slide that you presented, where 75% of the customers prefer to pay with their faces, is because they're seeing this new way of biometrics being used for experience, not only for identifying, like this police-like identification, it's also for having a better experience. And that's why you see this huge increase in acceptance for facial recognition over the past year.
So can you talk a little bit about the transition for digital ID from loyalty and receiving a promotion? Because that's a immediate, they really don't have much to lose, right? And it's immediate benefit. You get a promotion, you get a discount. Can you speak about evolving from that to using a Selfie or digital ID to authenticate a transaction?
Yes. So when we started working with loyalty, it was the best way to give something very clear to the user so he can choose to be part of this experience. Hey, I will give you my selfie, but give me something back. What I get out of it. So basically you get a discount, you get a gift. But once we started working with that, we felt that once we solved the engagement and the creepiness issue, and we have the customers very happy about being part of this experience. They love the brand, they love the experience, they like every time they go back, they love seeing their name. We asked ourselves, what is the next step? And what we found is that frictionless personalization is a great entry point for frictionless payment. So once you trust the brand,
frictionless personalization, I like that. Okay, that's
so
great. I just wanted to pause with that. That's really important.
Once you start feeling that you have this invisible thing going on, the next step is, of course, and for us was the natural way to go, adding a layer for payments. Because once you trust the brand, when you're happy about being recognized by a brand, then the next step is say, hey, if I have this beautiful experience at Uber where I sit, I get off the taxi and I'm already paid for, right? Why not I can have the same experience at a Starbucks? Or at my local coffee shop where I can just grab a coffee and just walk out and say, bye, Lindsay, you already paid for this coffee and thank you. So this natural way of moving from loyalty to payments is first because it's a natural way of improving the customer experience. And second, because once we solve the issue about privacy, the creepiness factor, you have everything tied up and beautifully solved. The next step is, hey, do you want to pay also with this? And 99% of the users will say yes. And you see it on your previous slide, they will love to do it. But you need to first address the human factor. You cannot jump into this technology and say, hey, I will drop a few cameras and do it. You need to first address the human factor, remove all the concerns from your users, be 100% respectful of their privacy, and then you can move to the next step. So usually my first conversations with any client is, they first want to jump into the technical stuff. How are you going to be sure that they want to jump into the security issues. And then I say, no, let's move the conversation back. Why you want to give this to your users, your customers? Why you want to recognize them? Is there anything for them? Are they going to be benefited by this? And these are the right questions. And you need to spend a lot of time as a brand asking yourself why you want to recognize your customers.
I love that analysis, Eduardo, because so often what I see is, us in the industry, any type of technology gets us really excited and we want to launch it. But it's really important to remember that the average consumer doesn't care about payments. They're not thinking about what kind of user experience I want. They want to consume products and services. They want to go about their lives. Exactly. So stepping into their shoes, I like how you approach that. So how do you, kind of one more question, then we'll take an audience question, is how do you guys, as you move into enabling payments, how do you integrate with payment providers and banks? Because me as a merchant, I want to have as few number of relationships as possible. And if I have to integrate with the bank and the payment gateway and a digital ID provider, how do you guys integrate with that payment component, and what are some best practices you can offer?
Well, that's a great question, because we are not trying to become a new payment gateway or method. All that technology is already there. If you see, you have the key players or the key, the main aspects of the payment industry is first the customer, then you have the merchant, and then you have the issuer, the bank, Spreedly, all the new technologies that allow for this to happen. And then what do we do as a technology at Facenode is we just connect all these players by using biometrics. So we don't want to solve the fraud management. So for example, you have technologies at Visa, like CyberSource, or you have all the payment, tokenization done already by brands like Spreedly. So that is already solved. So if we can somehow connect all these players together and say, can we provide a fantastic experience for the end user using biometrics? And can we connect that with the merchant by providing them with a very simple way to use facial payment at their store by just purchasing an iPad, for example? And then can we use existing payment gateways that they're all looking for new ways of remove friction? And that is where we stand. We connect all these players. So what basically we do, our core, is we recognize that your customer is at this point willing to pay. And then we can comply we can solve the compliance for privacy, because what we basically do is customer number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is standing in front of your barista and he wants a coffee. So I don't need to store your personal information, your name, nothing. We can just notify, the gateway or the bank through an ACH or the merchant and say, hey, this ID is here, it's willing to pay. And then they already have their CRM, they have all the fraud management, they can do all the checks that they have in place and make this happen. And at the same time, they are not risking having privacy issues, compliance due to GDPR law. So it's the best way to leave a company like ours to solve the biometric thing. And we don't store any personal information at all. And then we leave all the other players to do what they do best, like charging the customer, checking for or giving the coffee.
Okay, cool. Wonderful. Thank you. Abel, let's go to an audience question for Eduardo.
Yes, we have one here from Gerardo, which is, how do you open the door with retailers to charge, to change the customer experience for digital ID?
That's a good question, because you cannot add any new layer to the merchant. The merchant are already in a very thin spread about adding, more and more cost to their payment. So the way that we are solving it right now, we start to work with some bank here in Latin America, and we started to do some tests over some merchants. The way we are trying to solve it is just provide the merchant with a freemium way to use this type of technology. So if they just can cover the cost of a commercially available tablet, they can start using and charging their customers using this new technology. But if they want to connect their CRM and give them a full-blown frictionless loyalty experience, then they can pay for that. So the business model actually tries to remove any strain on the payment percentage, and leave the merchant just to switch to this technology to provide a better experience for their customers. So what we are trying to do is work together and integrate with existing payment methods that are already targeting the long tail of merchants. So we are not trying to address that ourselves. Let's leave the payment method that are already trying to reach the merchants, and we just provide some new experience on top of that.
Okay. I like, I guess a key thing here is to consider merchants are essentially users, right? They have their own, you have to win them over in their own right, giving them a freemium option to test it out, see if it works for them, and moving them through the life cycle as well.
Well, I mean, to add to your previous slide about QR code, it's not that we cannot compare with China. It's a very different market. But if you see over the past 5 years, they changed completely from cash and cards to QR codes. And now the next trend is that over the next 5 years, new and better technologies will emerge that will replace this type of payments. And of course, if you see companies like Tencent or Alipay, they're already including at their POS a camera. They all have some type of camera built in, because the next natural way to move forward is with facial payment. And this is happening very, very fast in China. You see the main 4 banks are already having, some type of biometrics installed at their ATMs, and you have thousands of merchants already using this technology. So the way I see it is that QR will naturally evolve into facial payments.
Correct. Cool. Okay, Abel, I think let's do another question here for Eduardo. We have a couple of good ones.
Okay, this one is basically saying, how can digital payment methods spread efficiently as opposed to cards, given the regional preference for cash?
So can you repeat it? Sorry, I lost you there.
Yeah, this says, how can digital payment methods spread efficiently as opposed to cards, given the regional preference for cash?
Well,
you know what, Abel, let's move to the next slide, and I'll invite Justin back on. This is kind of a general question, talking to everything we've spoken about today. So both you guys can speak to this.
just one small thing. The reason why Visa awarded us at the Visa Everywhere Initiative for LATAM and Caribbean is because we presented a way of using facial recognition to increase the digital inclusion. So basically, you have people in Latin America using cash, and a great entryway for them is just snap a selfie, prepay with their cash at Starbucks, and instead of buying, a Starbucks prepaid card, they will just prepay their selfie, wallet with their own image. And this is a very good way to add inclusion for people that don't have bank accounts. And then, as Lindsay mentioned, it's a great entryway for, letting them into the digital payments industry.
Perfect.
Yeah, the one thing I would add there for me, and hopefully my audio is good, so if it isn't, let me know. But the one thing that really strikes me, when I travel to Latin America, is there's such an alignment, amongst merchants, banks, payment providers, the government. They're all sort of united around, let's move away from this cash economy.
Everyone except the consumers, right?
Yeah. So, but you go to other markets and there's all this sort of squabbling going on about which payment method will be successful, and competition between the banks, and then maybe it's not even credit cards, maybe it'll be bank-to-bank transfers. What's amazing for me in Latin America is just everyone starts off with this foundational drive that I go and speak with, that I meet with, which is cash it's hard, it's dangerous, it's risky, it's subject to fraud, it's sort of not good for anybody, in the ecosystem. It's dangerous for the underbanked to walk around with cash versus other things. So I do think there's certainly lots of experiences that drive people's preferences still hold cash, but I've never seen a region where all the participants at least have this baseline agreement of, I'm not sure if, we want to be successful, but we all agree that cash, we need to move away from cash for so many reasons. So I would think with so many parties aligned, it bodes pretty well for moving away from cash, or, cash's dependency in the economy dropping.
I agree. And I like what you were saying. Well, let me organize my thoughts here. So what you're saying, Justin, is really interesting, because Latin America has some of the highest digitization rates in the world. When we think about social media, when we think about online communication, people are rapid technology adopters and hungry for a digital experience. Now, the payment component has dragged a little bit and been a little bit latent, because primarily fear of security. So, Eduardo, I like what you were saying about some of these user experiences, loyalty via Selfie, being a gateway into digital commerce, and Justin, as you were, bringing people into this environment where really the next step is to digitize a payment method. And if they're using cash today, maybe tomorrow, since they're already in this merchant's ecosystem, interacting with them digitally, making that transition to a digital payment method more smoother.
Yeah, and Justin mentioned security. So imagine snapping a selfie of your kid and sending him to your local restaurant without even taking his phone. So regarding security, being able to just pay by being you and not carrying
Just
with
pay
you.
by being you.
Yes,
Interesting.
just pay by being you. And then not only for kids, for the elderly, they don't need to carry their card. They don't need to confuse them about, no, it's just the natural way to increase security, especially in Latin America.
Hmm. So I want to get back, now that we're kind of talking about cash and the underbanked kids, there's a lot of movement in the industry around instant payments, ACH, real-time ACH. And, you know, Justin, I know you deal mostly with credit cards, but are you looking forward into the evolution of other payment methods, ACH or, you know, cash-based? How do you foresee that? Do you see people transitioning to a card more than ACH? How are you forecasting and thinking about alternative payment methods?
Yeah, I think for us, I mean, the way Spreedly built its business model was to be payment method agnostic. You know, we're not taking a percentage of a credit card transaction, and we did that with the idea being, if we want to truly be agnostic and valuable to merchants, we need to work with, and we need to be prepared for changes in the future that maybe don't run over credit card rails. It could be bank to bank. I think the interesting, I will say, our general experience when merchants go and look at APMs and when they think about them is that
APMs being?
Alternative payment methods or
Thank you.
local payment, you know, like local payment methods to LPMs is something we're hearing more because people don't like the idea like alternative. It's just more about being local. But especially people build an entire flow around a credit card. It's not just the payment method. They kind of take, credit cards have a particular way of transacting. You do an authorization. Are they good for this amount? Then you might hold that amount while you go and do some other things in your flow, like, do I have the goods in the warehouse ready to go? And now I come back, do I capture a partial amount and more later? And so they often come forward and say, hey, let's look at LPMs, APMs. They realize they sort of build flow around the assumption that they'll have a credit card process there. And so if you start talking about instant transfers, how do you claw back a refund? Can you do a partial? How do you know the amounts there? Are there different times involved? So I think there's a lot of potential for LPMs, and certainly if, you know, there's a big chunk of consumers who want it, that's critical. But what's really interesting for me consistently is not just the payment method that they're excited about, like they've built in this whole order flow around the way credit cards work and do authorizations and do captures and partials and refunds, and they realize like this is going to be a, you know, entirely different consumer flow in terms of purchasing from us.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think that ties into a couple of last questions I want to ask both of you. Abel, if we could go to the next slide. You know, alternative payment methods is something that the banks are concerned about, the networks are interested in understanding. You know, the networks today are, as I said, credit card continues to be the #1 payment method for e-commerce and any kind of digital experience. The infrastructure has not yet been developed fully for alternative or localized payment methods. And as physical cards start to become more and more digitized, we spoke about this in the first webinar with both Visa and MasterCard. What happens to your brand when that card disappears? You know, that card is the connection to your bank and the card network brand. So I want to ask both of you guys, how have you seen the networks respond to these changes? Have you seen them experimenting with other ways of putting their brand out there? And what do you think some of the implications are for banks and networks as physical cards start to be replaced by digital credentials?
Well, in our case, we got a lot of interest and help from the credit cards and specifically the banks. Many banks are moving towards the technology, especially in the last 2 years. They were somehow slow at the beginning, but now they can see that this is a huge trend. And the most important part is that by working, for example, with brands like Visa or MasterCard, you can achieve this kind of seal of security. So the creepiness factor is not only for the end user, it's also for the merchant. is also to know that, when the customer is paying, is not only my biometrics and my information and it's going to stay secure, but also the payment will go as expected. And in that case, having a brand like, for example, having certifications like Visa Ready, or there are a lot of industry standards where you can certify that you are, ready and secure as any other payment method. For us, is very, very important. So, of course, we're working towards PCI compliance and other industry standards, but when you have biometrics in place, you need to make sure that you use any opportunity to instill confidence. And working with Visa, working with Master, for us, and specifically also with banks. Right now, we're working with a major bank here in Latin America, and having this bank supporting on the background, saying, okay, the biometrics will go well, but also all the transaction will occur in a perfect way as well, and checking for fraud and having all the key checks in place for us is very, very important.
Mm-hmm. Justin, what are your thoughts? We talked a little bit about network tokens. What are some things you've observed?
Yeah, I think Latin America is very, so I think if you look at the card networks, there's sort of a little bit off and on schizophrenic about their brand, and so you'll see Visa Checkout, they invest a lot of energy with merchants trying to drive adoption for Visa Checkout, but then they understand that kind of puts them in competition with digital wallets, and it puts them in competition with the local banks that are in the networks, and so they'll pull back. In the US recently, there was a big acquisition. They bought a startup called Plaid, and for many, Visa did, and so many interpret that as an idea that Visa wants to kind of move into the credential space, and not really care about the payment, the actual payment, whether it's a credit card or a non-credit card, but really sort of go into the credential space and be that trusted brand that banks work with, because that was one of the biggest problems for startups like Plaid. They were connecting to banks doing some screen scraping. It's a security risk. So I think that you could see them, in terms of their brand, in terms of defending their brand, worrying about their brand disappearing underneath digital wallets. They send mixed signals and seem to often sort of go through different periods and different strategies. Right now, it seems like they've pulled back a little bit on the importance of their brand. When you think about them sort of pulling back on the Visa Checkout story and MasterCard story, and buying companies like Plaid, maybe they're now thinking more about being infrastructure, more about being identity, and continuing to facilitate transactions behind the scenes by leveraging their credibility, their relationships with banks, and their just the scale of their network. But it seems to fluctuate a lot.
Okay, so quite in alignment with what we've been talking about. Okay, great. All right, so let's take a look at our last slide of content today before we wrap up. And here we just want to, I'd like to ask both of you guys in 30 seconds or less, if you can predict, based on what you're observing from your own companies, what are the new payment flows that will be opened up because of digitized payment credentials? We have many examples here. Which ones do you think, these or others, are you really seeing traction taking place? Are you really seeing some acceleration? For the next, in the short term, which verticals would you bet on?
I guess I'll start just because I started. I think that ticketing and event concessions are already there. I feel like there's a lot of activity happening there. And what's really happening there is you're also getting an in-stadium experience. So the first thing is I want to buy a ticket on a mobile phone, first of all, and then the second is I want to access the arena with that mobile phone experience. And now what you're really doing is I want to have my hot dog and my beer, or whatever your regional equivalent is, delivered to me in the seat from the concession stand. Because we all know what that looks like if you try and go up there at halftime to service yourself. So I feel like that's there. Parking and tolls, I would add maybe to that, like the overall automobile experience. So purchasing gasoline, that's not something that's fun to do. Weather, grimy pumps. So I think people, the idea of getting in and out for gasoline and having it be a digital experience on your and
where we in Latin America traditionally have very long lines.
Long lines, right? So is there, you create that fast lane where you've already prepaid and things like that. So I think that's really interesting. Loyalty is a really obvious one. I think there's been payment via virtual assistants. Lots of talk about voice commerce. I don't think there's a lot of traction there yet. I would hold out for the likelihood that that's successful. It doesn't feel like it's happening now. And then cashierless stores, it's really nascent. It's probably end up being certain goods, versus it being an overall experience. It might be that certain goods really lend themselves well. And so the stores themselves change to what they sell if they want to really focus in on being cost efficient and cashier less.
Okay, wonderful. Eduardo, what do you think?
Well, my gut feeling would say, or my prediction would say in the next years, I can see a lot of invisible payment experiences moving towards merchants, long tail merchants, your beauty parlor, where you do your nails, where you bring coffee. So this experience about not paying, feeling that you are not paying. So basically we'll be speaking about payments somehow disappearing from sight and occurring behind us. So having this style of micro payments when you walk along your life. So think about the all-inclusive experience where you go to a hotel and you don't touch money for the next week or so. You just grab stuff and move along. Of course you're paying for all that, but the feeling that you have is that you are not paying at all.
You feel light, right?
You feel light. You don't need to carry your wallet. You don't need to carry your phone. You can just go for a swim, grab an orange juice, So I would say that over the next 10 years, I can see this happening. I can see this invisible payments trend moving into our everyday life, everyday payment like transportation, our coffee, our convenience store, shoppings, where you just enter your shopping and you can have, a new experience about entering stores and
a whole shopping mall potentially.
Yeah, a whole shopping mall saying, "Hi, Lindsay, today we can offer you," cross-selling. So there's a lot of stuff that will happen regarding this invisibilization of payments, I would call it.
Okay, wonderful. That sounds like a dream shopping experience. Okay, let's move on to our final slide. Next one. Okay. I want to thank all of you who joined us today. As a reminder, this webinar is part of a series in which we'll do a deep dive into each of the payment trends we've outlined for 2020. So today we talked about moving from physical cards to digital credentials. In our next webinar next month, we will talk similarly to the discussion today of cards disappearing. We'll talk about terminals disappearing. So terminalless acceptance. We go to the next slide, Abel. Please don't forget, again, our next webinar will be March 26th. And if you'd like to sign up already, if you enjoyed today's webinar, you want to continue to access this content and these learnings, in the chat box, we've just sent you the registration link to access that webinar. So we'll take a minute here to leave that up for people so that you can access that. Please join us. It'll be a very engaging conversation just as well. So just give folks one more minute to do that. And Eduardo and Justin, do you guys have any last thoughts, last tidbits you want to leave us before we say goodbye?
As a data junkie, I loved your slides on the mix from retail to e-commerce. And I noticed that was, dollar volume. And I think when you think about a lot of online commerce, a lot of food delivery, those are sort of sub $10 items. So when you think about it in terms of transaction volume, it's even more dramatic in terms of the mix and so card on file networks, merchants, but a strong change happening and probably even much more dramatic when you look at it in terms of transactional volume, because the retail ticket size is always going to be quite a bit larger than mobile.
Absolutely. Thank you for
weird
that.
thing to pick out, but I just enjoy that.
Right. Great. How about you, Eduardo?
Well, I mean, thank you for this. And of course, one of the things that most shocked me over the past year, I would say, that is that we all expect this type of new technologies happening at the, the main markets, highly developed countries. And what I have been seeing is that this is happening a lot on emerging markets. I've seen a lot of interest over these new technologies and higher rates of adoption in Latin America. I have a lot of companies calling me, banks, trying to try new stuff. So for me, it's a very exciting period right now regarding payments in Latin America. I think that a lot of stuff is going to happen over the next year, and I'm very excited about that.
Terrific. Okay, well, I want to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everyone who logged on today. A reminder, the content, the actual deck and the recording will be circulated for all of you to access at a later time. Thank you everyone for joining, and we will see you all at our next webinar on March 26th.
Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon, guys.
Okay, till next time.
Thank you very much.